There aren't a whole lot of things that could be worse than waking up early on a Monday morning to go to work. But that morning can be made a lot worse when you wake up and you immediately feel an electric shock running down your arm. It might not even be the thing that wakes you up. It might happen when you reach to turn off your phone alarm, and it might happen whenever you go to lift your coffee cup, which personally is where I draw the line, because nothing gets in the way of me and my coffee. But for normal people, that wouldn't be their concern. They'd be a little bit more concerned with, is this coming from a herniated disc? And if this numbness and tingling going down my arm is coming from a herniated disc, do I run the risk of hurting that nerve more if I move my head and herniate the disc further? Finally, people will start to ask themselves, is this pain permanent? And this is all terrible stuff to be going through your mind at 5 in the morning, especially without your coffee. That being said, this entire video is going to be a great place to get you oriented in terms of things you should be doing to help ensure that your neck is fully recovering, whether it's just a whiplash or a whiplash injury with a cervical disc herniation. But if you want to start a full program where I'm guiding you through day 1 after an injury all the way to fully recovered and getting back to your day-to-day life, check out the Whiplash Recovery Blueprint that's down in the description for you to download, and you can start your recovery today. If this is happening a couple days after a whiplash injury, you're probably in that heightened state, that fight or flight adrenaline condition, where your heart rate is always racing a little bit higher than usual, and your pain tolerance is actually increased because that adrenaline and cortisol help to dampen the pain signals. But as those signals start to wear off and you start looking for advice, you might hear a lot of, don't move your neck, keep your head absolutely still, and don't do anything that might put pressure on that nerve. And while in some instances that is sound advice, especially if you have a sequestered cervical disc, in other cases, keeping your head and neck completely still might actually be leading to prolonged issues and new, more complicated injuries to recover from down the road. That's why today I want to go into discovering whether or not your nerve pain is permanent. Fun fact, probably isn't. Because unless you fully sever a nerve, it can heal, whether that injury is coming from a chemical source or a mechanical source from pressure, if a disc fully exploded or if it's just bulging. So we'll get into signs and symptoms of each. But then I want to talk through a little bit of a disclaimer, because in some cases, yes, staying still is a solution, but more often than not, you're going to cause way more problems for yourself by staying still than by doing a little bit of movement that is going to help rebuild and stabilize that neck. We'll take a little bit of time to talk about the atrophy and disafferentation that follows a cervical disc herniation or a whiplash injury if you don't do the right things to recover. And then, so I'm not a complete jerk about it, we're going to talk to you about how you can recover, if and only if you follow these 3 rules. Because if you can't follow those 3 rules, if those 3 signs are present, it's a pretty good indication that you actually need to go see a doctor or surgeon to talk about what's going on in your neck. And finally, if you stick around all the way to the end, we're going to be showing you the full recovery program for whiplash injuries and cervical disc herniations. So with that, let's get started. A lot of the time when people start getting that radiating symptom down the arm, especially following a trauma like a car accident or similar whiplash injury, they start getting this idea that the disc bulging out of their neck is putting pressure on their nerve, and that it's going to work kind of like a pair of pliers, where if they turn the wrong way, it's going to sever that cord and they're going to lose all the feeling in their extremity. One of the things you need to know about the anatomy of a spinal disc is that there is a hard outer shell that I always thought of more like a celery stalk, and a nice squishy inside, kind of like a jelly-filled donut. That's the nucleus pulposus. It works as a cushion for high impact. Now, just because you get a tear in the annular fibers, that celery stalk on the outside of your disc, it doesn't mean that nucleus just squirts out all over the place. You need to have a lot of impact to actually rupture that disc on the inside so that it presses out and sprays on your nerves. And that's where we have our more common problem. Because yes, Pressure on a nerve isn't fun. If you've ever crossed your legs and your foot fell asleep so much that it hurt to breathe, you know what it's like to have pressure on a nerve. And when you can't alleviate that pressure, it's going to get uncomfortable. But it's highly unlikely that the jelly-filled donut inside your cervical disc is going to apply enough pressure to sever a nerve in your neck. Likewise, the chemicals in that nucleus pulposus aren't going to rip anything, but they are neurotoxic, meaning the same way blood is a chemical irritant for nerves, so is the substance inside that nucleus pulposus. And when it gets on a nerve, especially when it sprays all over the place, it causes constant inflammation and irritation, which to you feels like lightning running down your arms and tingling in your fingertips. Not a fun time. So a lot of the time, whenever patients have those symptoms of that going down the arm, they think that they're severing a nerve when in reality they're experiencing a chemical burn. They start moving their neck less and less for fear of making it worse and ripping that nerve, when in reality what's happening is you're getting all that chemical just built up in one area like a bruise, and since you're not moving, nothing is really pushing it out of the area, so it just hangs out for a long time. And as it hangs out for a long time, because it is acidic, it starts eating away the myelin sheath that encoats your nerves, which is literally a fatty tissue insulation that kind of works the same way insulation on a copper wire works. And without it, you can't conduct a proper nerve signal, and that nerve freaks out. And you get to deal with the pain. So first off, what happens if we stay completely still? We get that immobilization atrophy. Well, that is part of it. The muscles in our neck start to atrophy, typically the fine-tuned ones, the deep cervical stabilizers, which we need to hold the bones snug and also to help keep us stable. But then, after we do that atrophy for long enough, we start getting fatty tissue infiltration, so anything that might have been damaged from the whiplash injury, or anything that might have been bruised from blunt force trauma, we start getting fat tissue deposited into that muscle, which makes it more prone to injury down the road. Finally, and this has more to do with the muscle spindles inside your cervical spine, more so than it has to do with the nerves running down into your arm, we get disafferentation, which is a fancy way of saying the signals aren't right. So we already know that the signals coming from your arm going to your central nervous system aren't right, but equally important are the signals coming from the muscles in your neck that are telling you where your head is oriented. And then this ends up leading to long-term issues with arthritis, with pain, with hypertonicity in those neck muscles, which can then lead to pressure irritation of that nerve as it runs down into the arm. So that even once we clean up the chemical crap that's irritating that nerve, we're still going to have hypertonic muscles, which are then putting pressure on our brachial plexus, the nerves that innervate your upper extremity. And then to top this all off, we get what's called central sensitization, which is basically that your brachial plexus is always ticked off, the muscles in your neck and the nerves in your neck are always ticked off, and your nervous system actually starts to rewire itself to always expect to be in pain. So every little thing you do, from turning your head too fast to sneezing, is just a 10 out of 10 all the time, because your body is prepped for you to hurt. So if we actually want to fix this up, what we need to do is we need to clear out that chemical irritant from the affected site. And this is a process that your body normally does when we think about your lymphatic system, called mechanotransduction. It's a fancy way of saying moving stuff by moving you. As a muscle contracts and relaxes, it squeezes fluid out of an area, and then it sucks in more fluid as it relaxes. Think of it like a bellows or a dirty sponge. But Dr. Beck, you say, it hurts to even lift my head out of bed in the morning. How do you expect me to move my neck and do shoulder shrugs or whatever other crazy thing you think I'm going to ask you to do? Happy you asked, because what we're going to be performing are micro movements. And micro movements, typically whenever we talk about them on this channel, refer to isometric micro movements, where we are holding a position for 6 to 10 seconds to get a nerve to fire and hold a muscle in position. Whereas today, in the case of a herniated disc and trying to clear out the chemical irritant, what we want to do is do these movements small, without the hold, to try to get a muscle to gently contract and let go. So now typically where we'll talk about these micro movements as a chin retraction, simply sitting up tall like a puppet on a string, pulling the chin down and holding for 10 seconds, Now what we're going to do is start in this position, and then we're going to very small, look down, look up, down, and up, 20 times. Then we would rotate to the right and the left. Chin stays retracted, to the right and the left. And then tilting, left, right, 20 repetitions or until you start to notice irritation. Because while we do want to have a tiny bit of irritation from moving those muscles, we don't need it to hurt. This isn't a pain and gain situation. It's a minor discomfort to help move that chemical irritant out of the affected area and into the lymphatic system. Additionally, if you do have radiating symptoms from a disc or whiplash injury, we don't want to overstretch a nerve. They're already aggravated. So instead, what we're going to do is nerve flossing. And this is normal. Nerves are supposed to move easily through the connective tissue in your upper extremity and through into your neck. But whenever we overstretch them, they start to pull and cause more distress signals. Instead, what we want to do is what's called the waitress drill. Why it's called the waitress drill is because we're going to start as if we're holding a tray of food at a restaurant. And then what we do is we tilt our head towards the affected side. So in this case, tilting my head to the left with my left hand extended, hold briefly, and then we will tilt the head to the right and flex the wrist. And what we're doing with this back and forth flexion extension is we're never putting a lot of stretch on that nerve, but instead we're taking both ends of the nerve, going to the right, going to the left, pulling it through, helping it to scrape off anything that might be built up on its outer surface, but also breaking up any adhesions that might have formed between soft tissue and the nerve itself. Now, going back to our initial example, waking up with a disc herniation and no coffee is about the worst thing imaginable. But there is something worse, and that's when the chiropractor on YouTube doesn't tell you about 3 signs and symptoms that would suggest pumping your neck and flossing your nerves isn't going to be enough to fix your disc. And these 3 signs are pretty concerning subjectively and objectively, so hopefully you would discover them on your own. But just in case, I want you to be aware of, if you notice that you have weakness in your upper extremity for a cervical disc, this is a great reason for you to go to the emergency room or talk to your doctor. Because at this point, we don't just have sensory signals being blocked, we have motor signals being blocked. And while that is a good sign of a pretty hefty injury, it's also a pretty good sign that you're going to have some issues just getting around your environment, and that leads to a lot of safety concerns. Sure, you can drink coffee left-handed, but it's going to spill everywhere, and nobody wants that to happen. Now, the second thing that you're not going to be able to really test on your own, you would need to go to a doctor anyway to check this, would be a loss of reflexes. If your doctor hits your elbow and nothing happens, we've lost our deep tendon reflex, other sign of very intense damage that's happened to that central nervous system. And then finally, progressive numbness, which is a fancy way of saying you woke up in the morning, your thumb was numb, and then slowly your index finger, middle finger, ring finger, and then pinky start going numb, and it might even start spreading up the arm. This is an indication that the irritation that's occurring is starting to affect a larger and larger swath of the nerve. It might be at the nerve root, it might be more distal. If we're talking specifically about whiplash injuries, head traumas, and cervical disc herniations, we're looking here where the brachial plexus leaves the neck. And your best course of action is going to be to get that image to make sure that that disc sequestration didn't put further pressure or compromise to your spinal column, which is now putting pressure on your nerve. But the good news is, even if they check and you do have a couple sequestered discs, that's not a death sentence. Your arm's not going to be numb forever. This is something you can fix. Just be proactive about it and don't let it settle for too long. The other good news is, if they do check your neck and there is nothing structurally wrong besides the sequestrations, and there's nothing that they need to go in and clean up in terms of that nucleus pulposus fluid, then you really don't need any kind of surgical interventions. It's very possible for you to go somewhere like a chiropractor or a physical therapist and get cervical traction. Because that cervical traction, especially when a disc hasn't fully herniated, can help to pull that nucleus pulposus back into the center of your spinal column, And it can also help to gap the joints in your cervical spine to alleviate any of the pressure that's built up in the joint capsule from the injury or from your neck being overly rigid after the injury. Some of you might be thinking, heck no, I've seen cervical traction on YouTube. That's the thing where they tie a rope around your neck and then pull you off the table. That is not cervical traction. I don't know what that is. But cervical traction uses a similar device to gently, keyword there is gently, pull your neck tall so that it can gap the joints in between each individual vertebrae. It creates a negative pressure in that herniated disc to help pull the nucleus pulposus back inside. If you get ripped up a table, you're more than likely going to make that disc herniation way worse than it already is. So wherever you go, make sure that if they are going to perform cervical traction, it's the right kind and not the kind that's just going to blow out your disc altogether. That being said, cervical traction alone isn't going to completely fix your neck, because even once that disc heals up, we're still going to have an overstretch to those ligaments and tendons in your neck just from the whiplash and also from performing long axis traction, because we are going to be stretching your neck every time we perform that traction. And that's not a bad thing, it's just sort of as we take away from one bucket, we need to replenish it by strengthening those overstretched ligaments and tendons. And that's why a main focus of the whiplash recovery protocol that I put together is to take you from day one after a whiplash injury all the way out to fully recovered, where your neck is stronger than it had been even prior to the injury, so that you're not living with these symptoms long term. And that protocol link is available down in the description for anyone who's too far away to make it to the office. That way we can still work together without you needing to make the drive from wherever you might live. Additionally, if you are in the Brackenridge area, feel free to stop into the office or follow the link to schedule an appointment here on location so that we can work together directly and get you fixed up as quickly as possible. But also down in the description, if you're just starting to navigate this whiplash injury or a cervical disc herniation, check out the free resources I made available. You can download them, just follow the link, and it'll take you to an entire library of different resources to help you either get better imaging for your cervical spine following a whiplash injury, exercises and stretches you should either be performing or avoiding, different nutrients and supplements you can be taking to quicken the recovery process, in addition to a lot of other resources that will help you make the right choices while recovering from your accident. But all that being said, guys, the good news is that your nerve pain does not have to be permanent. The main thing that you need to consider are the right actions you need to take as quickly as possible to make sure that the healing is happening as well as it can without excessive buildup of scar tissue or excessive nerve irritation. So don't freak out whether this accident just happened or if it's a few years old. It's never too late to make a full recovery. And with that, I'm Dr. Beck. Thank you so much for watching. If you found something in this video useful, please leave a like. And as a huge thank you, here's a picture of a baby duck. And if you have any more questions or concerns that have to do with your whiplash or cervical disc injury, leave them down in the comments or check out the rest of the YouTube video, because we may have already addressed your questions in a previous video. So with that, I'll see you in the next one.